we've been in this. Really, I love how the Holy Spirit sometimes does this among us, right? We finished the sermon season at the end of February, and we were like, okay, we're moving into March. March is a terrible month. We've got 2 weekends. We know almost everybody's going to miss at least one of them. It's either going to be the start of spring break or the end of spring break. So why start a new sermon season in the middle of that? Let's just kind of go with the flow of where we're at. And we've kind of developed this unconventional sermon season of starting with Elijah. He's in depression, and he goes from depression to a new journey with God. And then we land with Samuel, who thinks his pinnacle ministry moment is over, and he anointed Saul, who failed, and he's ready to run back to mom and dad's house. And in the middle of that, God calls him to a new anointing and a new assignment and gives him a new vision for a new person to anoint in David. And now we're here at David. David gets to be our example today. And if we were to name this sermon season, I would name it Get Up. Right? That's kind of been the theme, right? God meets Elijah and tells him, get up. God meets Samuel and says, don't go there. How long will you mourn for what God has rejected? Get up. It's time to get back to work. And now we enter into David. And I'll tell you, this is one of my favorite sermons to preach. Not this sermon, but this text at a celebration of life or at a funeral, if you will. I think this wraps up how do we approach death, life, mourning, and all of the above. So let's dive in. 2 Samuel 12, 13 through 23. This is on the heels of David having an affair with Bathsheba, getting her pregnant. After she's pregnant, he covers it up by killing her husband and then acts like everything's okay. And Nathan comes and he confronts David and he says, do you really think you're going to get away with this? You've gotten your mistress pregnant and you killed her husband. And he gives him this analogy. And David says, whoever did that deserves punishment. And Nathan says, you are that man. I'm talking about you. Here's what David says. 2 Samuel 12, 13 through 23. Then David confessed to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. Nathan replied, yes, but the Lord has forgiven you, and you won't die for this sin. Nevertheless, because you have shown utter contempt for the word of the Lord by doing this, your child will die. I want to just insert this here for 1 second. We did a podcast on deconstruction a couple months ago, and I shared a little bit about this. I'll tell you, one of the biggest areas of challenge that I have with the Bible and Hebrew culture in the Old Testament is the loss of innocent life, is the loss of a child who was David's affair baby nonetheless, but this child's going to die, of the children of Israel leaving Egypt and the firstborn of all the Egyptians dying who didn't participate in the Passover and the loss of innocent life. And I'll just tell you, this is a whole sermon season, and if you struggle with that, if you see that and you're like, man, I have a hard time wrapping my mind around that. Here is the one thing I would tell you, and then I have a great podcast for you to listen to, and I'd love to talk to you theologically about this. But this brings the reality of atonement to the forefront and the consequences of our sins. And it brings it in a very painful and hard way to understand. But I can say this, men, you go off and have an affair, you know it's going to hurt more than your wife, right? Like there's going to be devastating consequences to your children, your family, and everything else. And if there were no atonement for that, there would be no reconciliation for that. Because Jesus is the atonement for our sins, and interestingly enough, it's the firstborn of the children of Egypt. It's the firstborn in all of these scenarios where you see this loss of life leading up to an atonement that theologically the only way we can grab a hold of it is if Jesus puts an end to it. That's the only way we can, because there's still going to be consequence for sin, right? Whether or not it's at the forefront of what we see or what you see or what anybody else sees, there's consequence for it. But Jesus is the grace and the mercy that brings atonement to some of the most devastating and hard to grapple with things in Scripture. So don't run away from that. I didn't, and I struggled with it for years, and I feel like the Lord has given me a grace in his mystery, and I'll share it with you if you're interested in that. So, child's going to die. Verse 15. After Nathan returned to his home, The Lord sent a deadly illness to the child of David and Uriah's wife. David begged God to spare the child. He went without food and lay all night on the bare ground. The elders of his household pleaded with him to get up and eat with them, but he refused. So what do we have? We have David, who is now lost. His son has an illness and is dying, and he is depressed. He is miserable. He's laying on the bare ground. He's refusing to eat, and all of his advisors are looking at him, and they don't know what to do. Maybe you've encountered somebody in deep pain, or depression, or loss, or deep hurt. Maybe it's been your 16-year-old that got broken up with, and she won't come out of her room, and she won't eat, and she won't come downstairs, and you're sitting there and you're saying, what do I do? I don't even, come on, you got to eat something. You got to come out sometime. This is where David is at, right? So verse 18, then on the seventh day, the child died. David's advisors were afraid to tell him. He wouldn't listen to reason while the child was ill. They said, what drastic thing will he do when we tell him the child is dead? They're like, no, he was unreasonable when the child was ill. He's going to fly off the handle when he finds this out. He's going to absolutely lose his mind. Verse 19, when David saw them whispering, he realized what had happened. Is the child dead? He asked. Yes, they replied, he is dead. Verse 20, then David got up from the ground, washed himself, put on lotions, and changed his clothes. He went to the tabernacle and worshiped the Lord. After that, he returned to the palace and was served food and ate. His advisors were amazed. We don't understand you, they told him. While the child was still living, you wept and refused to eat. But now that the child is dead, you've stopped your mourning and are eating again. David replied, I fasted and wept while the child was alive, for I said, perhaps the Lord will be gracious to me and let the child live. Verse 23, but why should I fast when he is dead? Can I bring him back again? I will go to him one day, but he cannot return to me. I was at Canaan's jiu-jitsu practice last week, and I was sitting with a guy, Chris Loop. He's a competitor, won double gold last weekend. Really just animal of a guy, and he was talking about a knee injury that he had, and he said, I was one of these wrestlers, and he was talking about wrestlers, and he said they are so well trained to migrate into jiu-jitsu because they've spent their whole childhood learning how to wrestle and grapple on mats and everything else, and we got to talking about this, but my high school, I went to Spring Hill High School in the dead center of Kansas, and I'll tell you, my high school was known in that entire region for wrestling. We had Iowa State, Nebraska, Oklahoma State, all of those schools were at all of our wrestling meets. They recruited our wrestlers. I had friends. I'm talking like if you know anything about Midwest and wrestling, those are the power schools. Like those are the dominant schools in wrestling, and they were always moseying around our program, coming to our meets and everything. I had friends that wrestled at all of those schools, and one of my friends in particular, his name's Donnie Abel. He wrestled at the University of Nebraska. And Donnie was, he looked like, those ears, cauliflower ears, looked like balloons blew up inside of him. He had these big old giant ears. He was just, his teeth were all, he one ear lower than the other. He looked like he was a wrestler, right? No, I'm just kidding, wrestlers, no offense to you. I know you roll me up and put me in a cradle. But Donnie was that guy, and Donnie placed in state every one of his years, freshman, sophomore, junior, senior year. But his senior year, he had this undefeated season going, and he was always like 40-2, 41-1, everything else. And towards the end of his senior season, we wanted him to go undefeated. We wanted him to be an undefeated state champ. But there was this meet, and at this meet, there was this kid named Nate Payne, who we all knew of Nate Payne. He was a state champion, and he wrestled 2 weight classes above Donnie. And Donnie was like, I want to wrestle Nate Payne. We're like, no, why would you do that? You're risking your undefeated season. Why would you do that? He's like, no. He's like, I want to. And so he wrestles. And this was like 20, 25 years ago, right? And I mean, our auditorium where the wrestling meets were was our gymnasium, had metal walls. You could bang on the metal walls and it sounded like troops coming to battle. I mean, this is like modern day gladiator stuff, right? We had all the stands full, all the students were around the mats, banging on the mats, and you had these two state champion wrestlers stepping into the circle together. It was like modern day gladiators, like two men enter, one man leaves. You know, it was like, here we are. And they go and they wrestle, and Donnie barely loses to Nate by points. And we were like, man, why would you risk your undefeated season? And he was excited about it. He's like, nah, he's like, I got my L. I'm like, what are you talking about? And I remember this. Donnie said, hey, nobody at the state tournament respects anyone who's undefeated. He said the scariest guys to wrestle are the guys who have 1 or 2 losses. He said, because you know that they've been beat before and they've bounced back from it. He said, people who are undefeated, that just means they haven't wrestled anybody harder yet. He said, when I go to state, I want to be somebody who has a loss. He was a state champion that year. He won his senior year state championship. And look, I don't know how theological it is, but I will tell you this. Every hero that we celebrate, bye Ezra. Every hero that we celebrate in Scripture, from Jewish history to New Testament apostles and everything else, they've taken an L before. Like, think about this. Abraham took an L, not once, but twice. Denied his wife was his wife, right? That's kind of a mess up. Noah built the ark, was a man after God's heart. God loved Noah, and then he got seduced by his daughter and slept with his daughter. That's an L. Job took an L. All of the minor prophets, the major prophets. I think Apostle Paul was killing Christians, right? He took an L. Peter denied his love for Jesus. I mean, you talk about all these guys. Here's the difference. This is why these people become heroes that we celebrate versus characters that we pass over. They are people who took an L and figured out how to get up. That's the difference. Why do we celebrate David? Not because he was a great king, because he literally wrecked his life and then bounced back and became a man after God's own heart. Why do we celebrate Paul? Because he's a man killing Christians and destroying the church, radically saved, turns his life. Why do we celebrate Peter? Why do we relate with Peter? Because he denies Christ and he denies his love for Christ, and then Acts chapter 2, he preaches and 3,000 people get saved. Because they learn how to take an L and bounce back. And David is our example for that today. David is the one who puts this on full display. David is someone who, look, I'm a pastor. And I was at a funeral last week. There was another one that I couldn't be at, that I wanted to be at, of another friend that passed away. I have seen a father step up to the plate at his 9-year-old son's funeral and share words of life. I have stood at a graveside where, I don't know if you've ever seen this, where a baby had passed away and they actually have the little baby. It's just gut-wrenching. And I've seen mom and dad standing there with a hole in the ground and their baby in this little container. It looks like a little cooler, weeping, right? Like I've seen these. I could never, I've got 4 children. I could never imagine that pain. Could never wrap my mind. I have been at a woman's house who that morning she kissed her husband goodbye, and that afternoon she got a phone call that he had passed away in a plane crash. And seen like the incomprehensible pain. How do we navigate that? How do we walk through that? How do we even approach that? David gives us the blueprint. So let's dive in here with David. We'll start 2 Samuel 12, 19 through 20. When David saw them whispering, he realized what had happened. Is the child dead? He asked. Yes, they replied, he is dead. Then David, what? Oh, come on. Then David, what? Then David, what? Come on, at some point you got to get up. At some point, God told Elijah, get up. Some point, God said to Samuel, how long are you going to mourn over what I've rejected? David laying on the bare ground, not eating, not sleeping, and then the baby passes away, and David decides he's going to what? Get up. David gets up, and then follow me here. He washed himself, put on lotions, and changed his clothes. This is really important to understand. This is where context and Bible study is really helpful for application, okay? Because David did something here that if we don't grasp the concept and the context of, we're going to miss completely what David did. David did not wake up and say, well, I'm going to change my clothes and put on a little bit of lotion here and freshen up. No. David will show you what he's doing. I'll give you a couple Old Testament examples. This was, how does Hebrew culture mourn? That's the question, okay? How does Hebrew culture mourn? Let me show you. This is Jacob after hearing of the assumed death of his son Joseph. Genesis 37:34. Then Jacob tore his clothes and dressed himself in burlap. He mourned deeply for his son for a long time. This is David mourning the death of Abner, who was one of his chief warriors. He loved Abner. Abner gets killed in battle, 2 Samuel 3:31. Then David said to Joab and all those who were with him, tear your clothes and put on burlap. Mourn for Abner. And King David himself walked behind the procession to the grave. This is a woman who's plotting to manipulate through mourning and steal land from the children of Israel. And look at what she does, 2 Samuel 14:2. So he sent for a woman from Tekoa who had a reputation for great wisdom. He said to her, pretend you are in mourning. Wear mourning clothes and don't put on. What are the two things that David did? He changed his clothes and he put on lotion. Act like a woman who's been mourning for the dead for a long time. In other words, mourning in Hebrew culture was symbolized by what you wore. It was tearing your clothes. It was putting on burlap. It was putting ashes over you. It was not wearing any sort of lotion or moisturizer or anything that would freshen your face. They wanted to look sunken, worn out, unkept, torn apart. Like mourning was something that you wore. It was something that you put on. So what does David do right after his son has passed away? He gets up. And what is part of his getting up? He takes off his clothes. That was not like an illustration. I'm just really kind of getting warm, but it fits, right? If it works, roll with it, right? He takes it off, but then what does he do? He takes it off and he sets it down and he leaves it and he puts on a new outfit and he puts on new lotion. In other words, Hebrew culture is this. David was not merely changing his outfit, he was ending his season of mourning. He was not putting on new clothes, putting on some lotion, guess I better shower today. He was saying, this time of mourning is over. And I'm putting it here, and I'm leaving it here, and I'm not putting it back on. Modern day, what do? We wear black to funerals. We wear something to symbolize we are walking through mourning. The act that David is performing in front of all of his advisors and in front of his family is profound. This is what David is saying by his actions. I am no longer going to be identified by that season of pain. Hear me now. I champion mourning. You go through loss, you go through pain, you need to mourn. You need to mourn. And there's a biblical way to mourn. We have a book called Lamentations that is all about lament. It is how we should mourn, right? Mourning is very, very important. But do you know the difference between someone going through a season of mourning and someone stuck in a life of depression? They never take off the outfit. They never take off the outfit. They constantly identify as someone who is mourning, broken, depressed, hurting, shattered, tarnished, wearing the burlap, wearing the ashes. The act that David is doing is he is saying, my time for mourning has come to an end. If you are going to get up, you have to put an end date on the season of mourning. That is not to say that you won't still feel pain. That is not to say that you won't see a picture of the person that you're mourning and your heart will still hurt and you may shed some tears and the difference is you're not still wearing the outfit. The difference is you're not allowing your entire look and identity to be defined by what you were mourning. It was wild. We went to my grandma's celebration of life, right? And there, I had a lot of family who were noticeably, you get there in the morning and they're upset and they're crying and they're hurting and everyone is mourning. Everyone's dressed in black. Everyone is mourning. Everyone is hurting. And then we have this beautiful, beautiful celebration of life. And then afterwards, we do the graveside. After the graveside, we go to a restaurant, and by the time we get to the restaurant, people are laughing, and we're having fun, and we're telling jokes, and we're remembering. I remember the first time I heard my grandma cuss. I can't tell you about that one. God rest her soul, right? But I mean, we're having these moments now that have gone from mourning to laughing, and I've been in these moments before, and here's what people usually say: I have so much closure after today. They have taken off the mourning outfit. David refused to be stuck in his pain. David did not ignore his pain. David put on the outfit. David expressed his pain. He fasted. He mourned. He prayed. He didn't eat. But when that season was over, what did he do? He put it away. That's what we have to learn to do. The first thing we have to learn to do is take off the garments of mourning when that season is over. Now watch what David does. 2 Samuel 12, verse 20. He went to the tabernacle and worshiped the Lord. After that, he returned to the palace and was served food and ate. Remember this, and this is really important. David is also the man who wrote 3/4 of the Psalms, and the Psalms are what? They're the Hebrew guide to prayer. They are worship, they are lyric, they are prayer, they are declaration, right? And most of what you read when you read through these Psalms of worship is you read about David overcoming his enemies and overcoming those who come against him. And he overcomes them by what? Worship. Worship and prayer. How does he experience victory? By worship. What are most of the declarations of the worship songs about? Him overcoming his enemies. In other words, David was one who knew, who lived, and who wrote about worship not just being a sacrifice, but worship being a weapon. Worship was a weapon by which David overcame the enemies of his day. You see it over and over and over. 2 Chronicles 20, what do we talk about? It's King Jehoshaphat, and how did he win his battle with the children of Judah? He won it through worship. Acts 16, how does Paul and Silas get out of the prison? They're trapped in a prison and they worship, and worship breaks open the doors of the prison. David writes about this over and over. Here's one, Psalm 27, verse 6. Then I will hold my head high above my enemies who surround me. What is David saying? I've got enemies, they surround me. I will keep my head up. How? At his sanctuary, I will offer sacrifices with shouts of joy, singing and praising the Lord with music. In other words, David recognized worship was not just sacrifice, worship was a weapon. How did David elevate himself above his enemies? Through worship. David was not a man who fought his way up, he was a man who worshiped his way up. David was not a man who was knuckles out. He was a tremendous warrior, yet what is the pinnacle message of David? Worship and prayer. How does he fight his battles? Worship and prayer. How do we overcome a season of pain? We put an end to our season of mourning and we enter into worship as a weapon that brings us victory. There are 7 words for praise in the Hebrew language. 2 of them, Shabbat and Barak. Not Obama, but Barak. Those 2 words are military terms. David uses them over and over and over, and they mean 2 different things. One is a salute to victory, and the other is a shout of victory. So you're reading through the Psalms and you're reading David worshiped and overcame his enemies. It's a military term of him saluting a victory, of him shouting the declaration of a victory. In other words, the Hebrew language makes it very, very, very clear. Our victory comes by way of worship. Our victory comes by way of worship. We have to understand this. This is funny. I'm thankful they got the edit right. I was thinking, right, like how do I illustrate this? That we have a weapon in worship that is greater than anything that the world can throw at us. And I don't know why, entry into how my mind works. Middle of the week, I'm thinking, what would illustrate that? And I don't know how, but I thought back to, anyone familiar with Beverly Hillbillies? Come on, you know the movie, right? Beverly Hillbillies, and Jed, there's a whole song about it. Some of you even know the song, right? Some of you kind of live that lifestyle, right? Of Jed he's aiming at an animal to kill for meat, and he shoots, he misses, the bullet hits the ground. When the bullet hits the ground, oil sprouts up, and when oil sprouts up, he's an instant billionaire, and he takes his family, and he goes to Beverly Hills, and as he's driving to Beverly Hills, he's cutting people off on the road, and he's driving crazy, and this car pulls up next to him and they flip him off, right? Because he's driving so bad. And when they flip him off, Jed looks at his son and he says, "What do you reckon that is?" And his son said, "I don't know, Dad. Maybe that's how Californians say howdy." So it became the California howdy, right? So then they're driving down the road and they're giving everyone the California howdy. And there's that California howdy. And so they're driving bad again, and they cut off another car, and it's this gangbanger. And this gangbanger pulls up next to him, and he goes, "Hey, you're a moron, and you drive like an idiot." And he goes, "Jed, what'd he say?" And I don't know what he said either. He said, "Let's just give him the howdy." And the whole car just gives him the California howdy. And here's what happens next.
That's real nice, son. This here's what I carry.
One frame before, and I would have had the older generation of our church so mad at me, right? One frame before. But then I love that. What does he say? "That's real nice, son. Here's what I carry." In other words, I've got a better weapon than you. I've got a bigger weapon than you. I've got a stronger weapon than you. I'm thinking in my mind, how do I illustrate this for our church when the enemy comes at me and the enemy has a weapon of warfare, be it pain, be it hurt, be it loss, be it depression? How do I reply? Hey, that's a real nice one. Here's what I carry. I carry worship. I have a song in my spirit that the Lord works through me in ways that the devil cannot stop me. What is worship? It becomes a greater weapon. What does David do in his season of mourning? He takes off the identity of it, and then he begins to worship as a weapon. And where does that lead him? 2 Samuel 12, 21 through 23. It says, his advisors were amazed. They're like, "What in the world? We don't understand you," they told him. "While the child was still living, you wept and refused to eat. But now that the child is dead, you've stopped your mourning and you're eating again." David replied, "I fasted and wept while the child was alive, for I said, perhaps the Lord will be gracious to me and let the child live. But why should I fast when he is dead? Can I bring him back again? I will go to him one day, but he cannot return to me." Forgive me for being a little soapboxy here, but it's really only found, it's other places too, but in Western church culture, we're really the only people that think we should pray and God should do what we tell him. And if God doesn't do what we tell him, we get mad at God for it. We blame God for it. We hold him accountable by withdrawing ourselves and trying to find some other means to satisfy our soul because dadgummit, God didn't do exactly what I told him to do. I think one of the clearest things you have to establish in your theology early on is God and you are not. and that means God may do things or things may happen or prayers may not be answered and your life may go in a way that does not make sense to you. And the quicker you can say, I prayed, I asked God to be gracious, and that didn't work out, so why would I stay in these clothes? I'm going to move on with God. That's what David is saying. He's saying, I prayed, I fasted, and I mourned when God could do something about it. But when God made up his mind, I decided to trust God. I decided to let my pain become this progress into a new season, not cause me to rebel, to reject, to deconstruct, to blame, and to place it all on God. And he didn't care about me in the first place, and question his love, and question his mercy, and question his sovereignty, all because I didn't get what I want. The trust that David demonstrates, the faith that he demonstrates. I asked God, he didn't do it, so now I'll trust God that one day I'll be with him again. That's what we're about, family. Like, that's what we're declaring. That's what we're about, that we can even walk through some of the greatest situations of pain and still trust that God has a life that cannot be taken from me. Even if it's taken from one of my children too early, that I can go to be with them one day. David takes his pain and he starts a new season with God. As I told you, March 7, Grandma, we celebrated her life, and my grandma and I, we had such a special relationship. In fact, look, I'm someone who keeps receipts. You need to know this about me. If you and I were firing shots back and forth at each other, you just better be ready, because I keep receipts, right? And I'm going to have a whole library when the time comes. And so I'm at my grandma's celebration of life, and I played this video with the whole family on the entire front row. I just wanted to let them know what Grandma thought of me. So guys, if you have that video, go ahead, play.
Who's your favorite, Grandma?
Say what?
Who's your favorite grandchild?
Well, okay. My favorite is Luke because he's the only boy.
You know I played that, right? They're all on the front row, and I'm just standing there like, anything you want to say? I'll be the one to speak today. Thank you, right? Here's the story behind that, and there's a beautiful story behind that. My grandma's first child was a boy who lived for 4 days and then passed away. And after that, she had 2 girls, Rexanne and Joy, my aunt and my mom. And then my aunt Rexanne got married, and she had 2 children who were both girls, Aaron and Emily. And then my mom, Joy, has me. And I'm the boy, right? And when I was a kid, I always remember thinking, like, my grandma's the greatest person in the world. She has me over to stay the night all the time. She makes me whatever dinner I want. She lets me eat as many Oreos as I want. She makes the best milkshakes on the face of the planet. She takes me to my orthodontist visits. She takes me to my doctor's appointments. She picks me up from school. Like, she was mom to me. And I didn't realize it at the time, but later on we would have these conversations, and she would bring that up. And I remember her saying one time that for me, having a little boy running around the house, causing chaos and making you the food that you wanted, and taking you to your orthodontist visits, and taking you to the doctor, and picking you up, and going to your basketball games, and letting you eat as many Oreos as you want. For her, it was a consistent reminder of what could have been with that little boy that passed away. And here's what my grandma did. My grandma took a season of mourning that she could have stayed stuck in her entire life. And she could have let the loss of that child characterize her look, her identity, her attitude, her focus, her perspective, and everything. But instead, she took that pain and she moved it into a new season of progress. And who got to enjoy the benefits? Me. So you say, like, what do you learn from a 94-year-old woman who was saved in 1952 and continued to follow Jesus? Here's what I learned from her: to take off the garment of mourning, to know when it's time to take it off, to keep worshiping the Lord, and to take the pain of that season and move it into a season that creates progress somewhere else. That's what David did. That's how we get up and walk through pain.